you aren't already, I invite you to become a member today. We are delighted to bring you this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our conference sponsors and the literary partner hosting this event, Letras, Latinas. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. Now, before we start, I need to do some brief housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there is no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. Lastly, we ask that you please be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 240-269-6635. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you, and now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Francisco Aragon, who will introduce this fantastic event.
Thank you. Letras Latinas is the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. The Chamartín train station in Madrid, 23 years ago. That was when our paths first crossed. We'd exchanged a few emails. He'd be traveling, he said, to Andalusia for a writer's residency. I suggested he pause in Madrid before heading south so we could finally meet. Over the years, we've had the knack of running into each other in fortuitous ways. May 2019, after being away for many years, I was back in Madrid for a poetry festival. Strolling past a bus stop at Plaza Cibeles, I hear a voice I recognize from a nearby bench. His. He's in town researching an article for the Los Angeles Times, but also to read in the same festival. September 2023, walking near the Jefferson building of the Library of Congress, and again I hear him, this time at a table nearby. We're in DC for Ada's first reading as poet laureate. We walk in together, take our COVID rapid test for the pre-reading reception. Afterwards, we dine on Pennsylvania, and I have the pleasure of hearing about his latest project, Latino Poetry, the Library of America Anthology, edited by Rigoberto González. I should say that Rigoberto has graciously invested his energies to Letras Latinas initiatives as well. Here's a partial list: Poetas y Pintores, artists conversing with verse; Latino Poetry, Pivotal Voices, Era of Transition, his lecture at the Library of Congress; the Letras Latinas Red Hen Poetry Prize, serving as our final judge; meeting with our Notre Dame graduate students, interviewing him for our oral history project; Pintura Palabra, for which he penned a chapbook essay on the ekphrastic poetry produced for this multi-year project; the session today on literary citizenship; and next October, he'll be back at Notre Dame for a 20th anniversary event where he'll be joined by Richard Blanco. One of my earliest memories of our other distinguished literary citizen this afternoon involves this very conference, specifically 2008. We were in New York, and the book fair, a multi-level affair, required walking up and down stairs. On one of those journeys, she and I met on one of the landings. The image that burns in memory was of her son, who couldn't have been more than a few months old, and was perched on her hip in one of those baby slings. But the Letras Latinas initiative I want to highlight is the one where she and I were in residence together along with 6 other poets at the Ragdale Foundation in Lake Forest, Illinois, thanks to a grant from the NEA. That week, in the fall of 2010, 8 Latinx poet editors convened to work on their writing, and after our communal dinners, retreated into the salon to discuss the challenges of wearing multiple hats. It was there that Carmen Giménez, J. Michael Martinez, and myself hatched the plan that would become the Acrylica series at Noemi Press, which showcases innovative writing and has published 13 titles so far. Our most recent, a reissuing of our series' namesake, the groundbreaking volume by former U.S. Poet Laureate Juan Felipe Herrera. Carmen has also judged our Letras Latinas Red Hen Poetry Prize, was also on campus in 2015 as part of a mini-conference. She also published ekphrastic poems in the Letras Latinas Pintura Palabra Folio in Poetry Magazine. And most recently, Carmen served as our judge for the Lorca Latinx Poetry Prize. In fact, she'll be back on campus this April with the poet she selected, Heidi Andrea Restrepo Rhodes, along with the poet who selected Heidi for another distinction, the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize. And that would be our current poet laureate, Ada Limon. And moderating that special trio of poets next April, back at Notre Dame, will be a recent addition to our Letras Latinas team. Laura Villarreal's debut poetry collection is Girl's Guide to Leaving, a book blurbed by, yes, Carmen Giménez. Laura holds an MFA from Rutgers University, Newark, where she studied with and was mentored by, yes, Rigoberto González. Laura arrived at our team thanks to a 2-year grant administered by the Academy of American Poets, a grant we would not have landed without the crucial skills of our then Poetry Coalition fellow and now part-time Letras Latinas associate, Brent Amanero, whose debut collection, Faces Made of Clay, will be released in June. I mention Brent because I can't underscore enough how both he and Laura have transformed Letras Latinas. We're a trio now, and we strive to remain one for the foreseeable future. Before I end, gratitude. First, to our 2 ambassadors of our Letras Latinas booth, Emma Trellis and Alexandra Litton Regalado, and finally, a heartfelt thanks to Jim Wilson, whose generous gift is making the 20th anniversary celebration possible. And now it's my pleasure to put this session in the very capable hands of Laura Villarreal.
Thank you so much, Francisco. And thank you so much to everybody here today. I'm very happy to be here with both of you. I think Francisco touched on a lot of ways that our lives have intersected. Rigo, you were my MFA thesis advisor, my professor, and you were my earliest mentor in this writing life. I speak for many of your students when I say that we've been guided by your example as a literary citizen. You spent many years as a book critic, and you're the Camino del Sol editor at the University of Arizona Press. And Carmen, I have long admired you as a poet and publisher. You helped bring my book into the world, and you wrote just the most gorgeous blurb for it. You're an exemplary literary citizen through 20 years as the publisher at Noemi Press. You served as an editor for The Nation alongside Stephanie Burt. You are now the publisher and executive director at Grey Wolf. And for both of you, these are just tiny, brief descriptions of your work as literary citizens. In addition to your work, you're both extraordinarily prolific writers. So I'd like to invite you both to read some poetry. Carmen, will you please get us started?
Sure. I wasn't sure it was on. Yeah, I'm going to read just a couple of poems and just be mindful of the time. I'm going to read first a poem that's not related to the series that I will describe right now, which is I'm working on a series of poems called Paintings I Can't Remember. And they're basically about having glimmers of, they're ekphrastic poems, but they're more about, like, I can't remember the artist or the painting or entirely, or just it's more impressionistic. But first I'm going to read a poem called Screaming. In Lima, my mother screams from her bed and from a garden and in the parlor of her nursing home. And she screams as they wheel her down the street and when they change her diaper. And my aunt texts me to tell me about her screaming. And I'm left to imagine what's at the score of her new tongue, a smattering. And in the last video, she screams, mis hijos, which I cling to because it means we still exist in her. And she screams in horror, like waking up in a dungeon, the yowl at the end of death. She is the loud wail of all humans suffering, telling of our basest truth, the barbaric yap, but divine as great whale song. Yet she calls from miles away, and I want to answer her call. So I scream back into the chirp of cicadas, the rustle of trees, past the rush of highway, towards the clouds where planes zoom southward, over the thin air and Andean peaks, the scream vibrating outwards, send it out to touch at the edge of her scream, so she feels me, hija, inside her shudder. An art film I can't remember. The lover bought a TV for us despite a professed hatred for such bourgeois trappings, so we could watch French New Wave movies, and all I have left of our last afternoon is a 60s siren in a black turtleneck. I didn't plan this. So there's the lover, me, the screen, and the iceberg of contempt planted there too. It was April and the lover was in love with someone else, which I discovered reading the journal they left carelessly at the bottom of their drawer underneath their socks. The lover was waiting for me to leave so they could then A, break up with me over the phone, and then B, give the TV to a neighbor, which they did the following week. Giving the TV away hurt me more than the ending of the sad sequence of months we strung together, having sex in the weird satin sheets I first loved, then hated for their arty affection and stifling heat. The movie featured inseparable lovers in sharp contrast. Everyone smoked aggressively, and desire was a man gripping a woman's shoulders, filled with avant-garde love, which meant intense and world-changing rebuke in his lips against hers. An actor and actress giving in to the ambiguous tension of boring art movie symbolism. A nuclear end to my refinement buzzed in the air. A Virgin Mary I can't remember. Gilded hem throbs pearl and blue, eyes cast up or down or ahead, blank at first, then a tinge of divine. My grandma filled a photo album with images of Virgin Mary over and over, Cubist and Impressionist, dressed in vague Latin American traditional dress, sepia, cooing, reading, surrounded by angels and mosaic and stained glass and red and gold cellophane. Her reverence was private and queer and made it so I'm fluent in Mary discourses. In museums, the prayer I memorized so young comes to me. Blah, 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 it'll be done to me. I once thought all women's bodies contained fruit. Like her, I'm a mother, so each face is a mood I've known, despair or reverence or angst, Mary exasperated, Mary indifferent, or in post-nursing bliss, or aware of an artist's eye on her as praise, virtuous Mary vessel, trope, maiden, queen, subject, high bar, fleeting. The Marys bear a golden child whose eyes stare past her or straight at the painter, preternaturally limber and light, haughty. The child never registered much for me, a baby of all want, Mary most body, Mary dismay, despair, ecstatic, Mary mouthing help. A painting I can't remember, 14. Shapes coalesce into lavish curves. Mathematics goes soft, bound now to the singular arc and fold of flesh. Rectangles and cylinders and ovals become body. I draw the liminal moment that forms when a constellation of shapes becomes you, your discrete forms as the subject, the amorphous sound of the air's dense disruption, oval of breath, opulent, oblong in motion, ripe and dark isosceles. And I'm going to just close with one last painting I can't remember, a painting I can't remember, 8. A painter creates dimension in no dimension, slinks hummingly into eros and the chatter of words, the eye song and the rush of ear dizzy, music, food, words, and sex all at once. A painting is a texture riot. No, it's heaven. No, it's time's fracture. A human becomes a scrap of matter to the painter who builds an armature of thrill in the patron's skull. This is me trying to paint myself a painter with my meager skills down to her cigarette and ragged white t-shirt. The painter's bed gives me bed bugs, but somehow I'm grateful.
Buenas tardes. All right, what a week. I can't let this moment pass without saying how proud I am of Laura. You know, they receive their MFAs and you send them off and you say mentally, go out and dream even bigger dreams that I dare to dream, and they do. All right, so this is for all those years I said to Latino poets, stop writing about your abuelitas. And then 2020 came upon us, and I started to write about abuelitas. Summer songs. The rain, of course, as it dings every leaf on the eucalyptus. What was it doing there on the US-Mexico border, so far from its native lands? You might have asked your grandmother that question. She too, so far from home. She too, singing in her beloved Purepecha tongue, Mederush Kankawish Nirashingya. Again, I'm going to sit and drink. Drink what? The rain, the sorrow of thirsting for sounds that take us back among our kind. Is this why she sat beneath that tree all day, sweating in the heat? To water the soil, to plead to the tulips, they too displaced, grow, grow, grow. Oh, desperate wish, if they didn't burst open all spring, not a chance in July. Then again, who would have guessed a tree from Australia befriending an indigena from the mountains here in the arid and dry Sonoran desert. Then again, the miracle of summer rain, and your grandmother's song inside that song, and the tulips aching to be free, hum, hum, humming along. Presto. The magician placed a rabbit inside the red box, and with a wave of the wand, presto, it went up in smoke, now a stunned dove on stage. He waved once more, and presto, another blast of smoke, another dove. The birds became exotic, even though Abuela kept a palomar in the back of the house, the ground snowy with down, but so stinky, Abuelo called them turds with feathers. How she missed her birds, the way I miss Mexico, and every word that sounded Mexican tugged at my heart. Presto, the magician yelled, and I wanted to switch places with the doves that must have come from Abuela's palomar in Michoacan. I had been inside that cage to clean it out so many times while Abuela pleaded with me to be careful in case an egg had fallen from its nest. Let's put it back, she suggested whenever I found one, and I wanted to be put back the same way into that palomar where the dove sang cucurucucu, cucurucucu, and the smell wouldn't bother me anymore because I would be home again. Oh, magic man, presto, 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 everything back to Spanish, dove to paloma, house to casa, abuela to happy lady caressing her birds in the glorious Mexican afternoon. And so, lo que se ve no se pregunta. In this case, my body has changed, is changing, and I think my poetry is finally catching up with that. The trees keep weeping long after the rain has ended. Just as I keep moving long after my body stops at the door, the sidewalk turns the corner, and there I go, smooth as the sailboats of Puerto Rico that drift into quiet thought on the horizon. The boats float over the sun's reflection, leaving it behind to shudder on the cold surface, alone. My body knows such abandonment whenever I'm 4 steps ahead of it. Some mornings, I catch the train just before the doors close. On the platform, my body slumps over its cane, looking betrayed and forlorn. When the train zooms into the tunnel, for a minute or two, I deceive myself into thinking that my body will never find me again, that I'm free, finally free of the slowpoke who takes away my dignity at the airport where I'm forced to board on a wheelchair, even though I can do so on my own. Is it really gone? Where are the New York City subway acrobats with their loud music and peddler hats? I want to spin around the pole with them, jutting my feet into the air. My backflip will not be as spectacular as theirs, but give me time to get used to this. I too was young. I took a dance without affliction once, a very long time ago. But just before I get lost in daydream entirely, I notice my body looking back at me from the mirror of the window, weary yet intact. It made it to the train after all, and I'm ashamed to have misjudged its capability. How stupid. It is I who needs to catch up to this body. Its persistence and grace, how it makes itself so public, defying stares and second looks, how it's unafraid to be the center of attention, like that sailboat at sunset that doesn't drift away as I once believed. It shows the way. Here, timid sun on the water, the boat says, I'm clearing a path for you, not so you can follow, so you can travel right beside me. Let's go. I get it now. Just as the trees weep long after the rain has ended, So too the heart beats while the body's not in motion, and while it rests, and while it sleeps. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you both for such gorgeous readings. I'm glad that we started the panel by getting some of your words in the air. I think all of us know that there's a lot of work to be done in our community, most of which is on a volunteer basis. You're both distinguished literary citizens now, but I think it's important to discuss your trajectories. How did you get to where you are now, and what were some of your first roles as literary citizens?
I've always been interested in publishing. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a journalist, and so when I was in college, I worked for on the literary magazine. And after graduate school, that was when I started Noemi Press. But I liked making little handmade books. I liked the life of that, and so one of the reasons that I started Noemi Press at the time, there were very few presses that were publishing BIPOC writers, especially BIPOC writers who were, more experimental, or they were kind of very siloed in a way. And, I had this very ambiguous sense of wanting to have a press that published writing that was innovative and that was hard to categorize, and that published BIPOC writers, but that didn't silo us, that was the main story about what we did. I believe there was a kind of ethos or a paradigm shift that the publishing world required in general, to say that, oh, we can check the box. We have our Black writer, we have our Asian American writer, so we did our, and then that becomes the space that person occupies, as opposed to having, a role as an aesthetic influence, a formal influence, or any number of things which, Rigo was doing so actively, across genres. And so that really was how I got started doing that work, was just, I started making chapbooks. That was what we did for many years, and then it went from there.
That's really cool. I think that really shows in the books that have been published by Noemi. And as a young writer, I always admired them and loved the ways that they were kind of rangy and unable to categorize them. Rigo, what about you?
I have to credit my family for that initial fire, that fuel, because I come from 3 generations of migrant farm workers, but they were also organizers. My grandfather was an organizer during the strikes, the UFW strikes. My mother was an organizer as well, risking deportation, because that was always a threat. So we knew that to participate meant taking risks. To participate meant that not everybody will be happy with what you did. But to participate also meant that you're trying to build a community, find a community with the people around you, have a voice, have a collective voice. So everywhere I went, that seemed to be my ethos. I was at UCR, and I was one of the founders of the Ballet Folklorico there. And then when I was a graduate student, I helped establish a funding source for students that were out traveling abroad to deliver papers, or traveling across the country. And so when I arrived to New York City, I came with the same sort of idea. I didn't know anybody. And so I started looking people up, and I have to shout out one of those first people that welcomed me to New York City. I saw this name, Sergio Troncoso, giving a reading at a bookstore in the World Trade Center. And I just showed up. I showed up, and I just started talking to the guy, and he seemed cool, and mira, here he is. Todavía no me deja en paz, ahí todavía. But, and so because I know that it's in us to want to build and communicate. And so immediately for me, okay, what can I do? What's missing? And one of the first things that I recognized, because when my first book, and even Sergio's book, and I think Sergio was the one that got me started, now I think on book reviewing. And it was like it was over dinner, or we're at lunch. And somebody, Ramon Rateria, the editor of El Paso Times, was talking to Sergio and telling him, well, maybe trying to convince him to do it. And Sergio was like, well, I don't want to do it. Well, you want to do it? You know, I said, yeah, I'll do it. I only had written one review ever in my life. And next thing you know, I did it for 20 years, you know? But it was necessary because our books were not being reviewed. Even our amazing books were not being reviewed. And they're still, in many ways, not being reviewed. But, you know, I saw it, I said, you know what, that's what I can do. I can at least create this body of work so that people can show other people, so that people, because everybody takes the critics seriously. If somebody says, this book is worth reading, somebody's gonna wanna read it. And I've been so fortunate that there's been this community out there that's been spreading out. Social media came at the right time too. So his reviews were spread out all over the place, even though they were in El Paso Times. But the best thing that El Paso Times did was they would post them online. So his reviews traveled all over. And it was fantastic to see that body of work begin to accumulate. And so ever since then, I just never questioned that I could do these things, like write an essay, write a review, all these things that I didn't do at the time. So for me, it was like, that's the fire is like seeing the community, what's missing in the community, what can I do, and having the community feel as if something is being done for all of us.
I love that question. I love that answer. I guess for like a lot of younger book critics, it can be a little nerve-wracking to write your first review. Do you have any advice on how to just jump in?
You know, nobody would turn down a book review. Seriously, you go to magazines. I mean, they're always. That's why I can understand if you're like, yeah, but what do I do with it? People are, because not enough people are writing them. It's a rare commodity, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you hear, oh, I do book reviews. Oh my God, you're like, last thing they want is like, I have a poem, or I have a story that you want to publish. I have an essay. That's the last thing you want to go in there because they got plenty of that. But you go up to any of these journals up there and say, you publish book reviews? I got a book review. I can guarantee you. So it's really just jumping in, right? And in terms of is there like a formula or anything? You know, you got to read them. You got to read them. And there's plenty of free stuff out there to read, you know?
Yeah.
Read my books. I mean, that Pivotal Eras, I got a whole bunch of reviews in my Pivotal Eras book. Read that book.
Yeah. And I think both of you both kind of just jumped into your respective roles. Carmen, you were already kind of making those books. What were some of kind of the initial challenges when you started Noemi Press? Was there anything you wish you knew?
Don't put things on your credit card. Try to get other people to give you money first. That's absolutely true. I think realizing that there are people who will catalyze around you and help support you, that you don't have to try to do everything on your own. I think that was good advice that you gave me very early on too. You know, it's finding community. It's finding people who want the same thing. They're out there. I mean, I think it was different because social media didn't exist, so we were kind of finding each other, just like, do you have that person's email, and sending an email and just making connections. There weren't these and creating these networks and these friendships that have been so sustaining and so important. I've been thinking a lot about how when you look at historical aesthetic movements, how much of them are based in friendship. And I feel like that we lived in a kind of a heyday just across aesthetics too, of people who are really in it for each other and supporting each other and lifting each other up. And we're very lucky to, when we would meet people, it didn't matter where you come from, who you were. We were just so excited to connect. I remember I met Rosal Cala, many, many years ago at a job interview. And I was just like, A, I had already fangirled her, and B, I was just like, you are the person, like, and I called her, I was like, we're gonna be friends, like, you don't have a choice. And here we are many, many years later, because you're hungering for that community. And so I think really seeking out, being brave about it. I think I was always nervous to approach people. I was so intimidated when I first met Rigo, not realizing that we're all just looking for that connection and kinship. That's really important and true.
Yeah, I mean, also same. Rigo dresses so beautifully that it's, you get a little intimidated, a little shy. But I feel like, you know, in the age of social media, like you can follow people online, but you don't necessarily reach out to them. It's like you're passively watching. I really like that y'all create a community by sending emails, correspondence. I think we probably need to do a lot more of that. Do you guys feel like your work as literary citizens informs your creative work in any ways?
There's an energy, right, that is required. And sometimes what I hear people say, oh, I don't want to do that because then I won't be able to do this. And I can't remember any of my mentors voicing that concern. It was never a question. It's a, you have energy, you're going to use energy for all of it. There was never really a choice of whether or not, well, if I do this and I can't do that. You know, some of my important mentors, they just did it. You know, if there were any questions about it, I never heard them. If there were concerns, it never showed. And yet, they were still very productive. They could still do their own creative work, and yet they were also building community. So that's my motto. And my motto was like, you know, yeah, I'll complain in private, absolutely. But at the same time, it doesn't stop me. I feel like, you know, I just feel like it just, they're both hand in hand for me. It's important to do both because I feel that, you know, there's the writing happens in the desk by myself. The activism happens out in public, and I like occupying those two spaces. There's nothing that says that you have to choose one or the other or compromise one for the other. And I get it, other people have other obligations. I'm not going to make any judgment about that. But for me, it has always been, I'm going to go ahead and do it all. And I think to echo what Carmen was saying about bravery and courage, you really do. You cannot be afraid. You know, you cannot be afraid, especially now when there's so much opportunity, when doors are opening, you know, and think about those that came before us who had to crack those doors open, right? The doors were not opening for them, and yet it was that courage to at least kick it open a little bit so the rest of us can, like, finish kicking it open completely, right? And so it's just the bravery, it's just the courage to do it and not be overthinking it, like, oh, they're going to think this or that. Like, oh, Dios mío. It's like, I know, we're all, you know, Latinos, we're Catholic, I get it, but let's get over that.
Yeah, absolutely in agreement with that. And I think too, what's really beautiful about editorial work is it's such an intimate conversation that you get to have with another writer about their work, and the work of having to articulate how something gels or doesn't gel, and really having to inhabit something when you go through. I mean, I was joking with someone about how traumatic my workshop experience with my MFA, and it just was. And I think when I started Noemi Press, what we saw editorially was just a lot of BIPOC writers who just wanted to, like, bury that part of their life and didn't have that really positive communal experience. And part of the work that Noemi did with many writers was to allow a reconnection to the work and a deep immersion in the work, and a communion with the work. And that's always been such what I love about editorial work. And so I'm an infinitely better writer for all of the writers who've allowed me to enter their work and talk to them and be in dialogue and help them find, you know, to live in the maximum capacity of what's possible in their own work. And I, you know, the amount of reading that I have to do as an editor has also informed the work. But I think just more generally, it's the spirit of being part of a community, especially poets. We create our own audience, we create our own discourse, we create our own body of cultural criticism. Again, there are people who are just, you know, making work, and that's great, but that's not the way it's ever worked with art. We all have to participate in lots of different ways, and it doesn't mean that you have to go found, you know, some kind of organization, but there are infinite number of ways that we all can participate in the ecosystem, even by just buying books at the book fair, is part of it. But the system is perpetuated by us, not just by, you know, not by us as being cultural producers, because the cultural production part is actually such a minor part of how art has a major role in the lives of people all over the world.
Yeah. Both of you do something very similar. You're always thinking about the future. You're shepherding the next generation of writers into the world. I have a question for each of you separately about that, but I'll start with Rigo. As a professor and mentor, you have such an influence on your students, and we talked about this a little bit last night. We were reminiscing over dinner, but you used to take us out to museums, you would take us out to other readings, you would get us dinner when we were poor grad students, and it was like the one real meal we ate in months. You did all of that outside of the classroom, and then in the classroom, you know, you fed our brains. You would bring us free copies of books to read. You would recommend them. You would loan us books. Could you talk about, if you had a single piece of advice to aspiring writers for how to move through literary life, what would that be?
A single? Just one?
I mean, go ahead.
Dios mío. I think that one, as you move through spaces, and I do want to also shout out the importance of AWP on that journey. You know, AWP has been part of my life and professional journey from the very beginning. I started coming here as a graduate student. I came here as an unemployed writer. I came here as an employed writer, as a professor, as an administrator. AWP has been there at every step because this is a place where you can find all these people, right? And so the one thing that I've learned, and this is not only through the way AWP does things, but you know, when we had, one of the organizations that we had for a second was Continta. And in Continta, AWP was our meeting place every year. And every year we would celebrate, we'd bring in, you know, all the young writers, any Latino writer we find, like, come on, let's go, come on, let's go to this little party. It started out in our rooms, and then we moved on to the restaurants, and finally, you know, but it was always the young people, and we always honor an elder. And so the one thing that I've learned is, like, you have to, as you look back, as you look forward, as you look into the future, you have to look at the past, the recent past, and those who came before us. Don't forget that you are part of a lineage. You are not inventing anything. You are building on something, right? You're building on an important foundation, but that's a good thing to recognize it, because whatever you build has to be as strong, has to be as significant, has to be as wonderful, right? So that the next generation can also build on top of what you build. So as long as you understand that you are part of a lineage, you know, not the beginning and definitely not the end. And that's the one piece of advice, because I think it's very, very easy to be seduced or consumed by the sense of doing it for yourself. And I think that that's the loneliest way to journey in this world as a writer, is to be alone. We're already alone as creators. Why do you want to be alone on the rest of your path?
And Carmen, when you moved to Grey Wolf, you didn't let Noemi Press close. A lot of small presses will shutter if somebody leaves, but you ended up handing it over to Anthony Cody and Susie F. Garcia. Did you give them any advice as you turned over the press to them, or any guidance?
Yeah, and I'd add that it also Sarah Jemsky, who's the who's a major
you.
force of that. You know, I mean, I definitely am available for any kind of counsel that they want, and you know, and they know that. But I think what I wanted when I started Noemi was, and I was getting ready for it, I think, was I wanted to be able to walk away and let someone else decide what it could be next. And I think, like anything that you make, you have to make it so someone else can occupy that space, because you are part of a lineage. You don't know everything. And in so many ways, Anthony and Susie and Sarah had already been such key players. So it wasn't like I was Noemi, and now that we were all Noemi, and so it felt right already for me, even without what happened with Grey Wolf, for me to really let them, because they were making almost all of the decisions. I was very occasionally acquiring books and editing with them, but they were making a lot of the really exciting decisions that got us where we were today, and so it was time for them to really take it on. But I'm thinking a lot about what you just said, Rigo, and one thing that's challenging is with such a crowded space, it's hard to think about, it's hard not to dwell in the transactional. And I think the transactional is one of the darkest parts of the work that we do. It's really important to make connections and create relationships. But if they're purely transactional, and I think that's why this work is so important, it takes the soul away from art. And everybody should be getting paid as much as they can for the work they do, but it's impossible for everyone to be paid in art as equitably because it's always going to be an imbalance. Someone is going to bear an undue burden of the work if we're not all pitching in, and if we only imagine that the work we do is about making connections and networking. I think network is an interesting term because it's about pulses that go back and forth between each other. They're not just outwards, right? We also have to be taking things in. And so in a way, I think like writing a book review isn't just about like participating, it's in being in conversation and helping the art form grow. I think it's interesting that part of what I see right now with the dearth of book reviews is we're not looking at the way in which there are major aesthetic and formal movements that are taking place among kind writers, because no one and I understand there are limited resources, but I would love for someone to just saying, look at this group of writers who are talking to each other and they're writing together and they're writing similarly. What does this say about our historical moment and how we can build off of that? I think that's what's really important about how we work as a community, that we can also acknowledge that, because great art is built off of great art, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I think that also goes into what you were talking about like poetry and writer friendships. I think we're always kind of inspired by each other's work. I wanted to ask if you had noticed any notable trends, especially going off that last question. What are some of those groups that you're seeing, some of those movements formally? This is a question for both of you.
You know, as I was working on this Latino poetry anthology, one of the exciting things that I think we've known this is happening, but it was very nice to see it in the work, is that the conversations about the body were very different, and of course built upon previous conversations about the body, or the issue of identity now has become more complicated and nuanced, where there was a moment where Latino poetry had reflect specific like national identities, right? Because the community had to somehow shape a kind of definition or communion. And okay, so we've established this Latino, this is Puerto Rican, Dominican, but now we have the nuances, the estuaries of these identities. So that's been exciting to see, without having to feel as if you are denying, you know, the conversations that happened before, but rather acknowledging, okay, those are still conversations we have, but now we can add more to that conversation. So that's been exciting to see in the work, especially with non-binary and trans writers. I mean, that was incredible to see that shift, challenging even some of the language that we use to talk about the body, talk about identity. So that's one of the things that I noticed and that I celebrate in the Latino Poetry Anthology.
I'm excited to see how people are using archives and histories and documenting different stories, and just, I mean, the acknowledgement that we can learn about history from art I think you definitely see that in contemporary poetry, and also just the sequences, long poems. I love long poems, and I think a lot of a lot of poets are engaging with obsession in that particular way.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that too. I was just having a conversation with another poet. We've noticed that more books are using family photos, personal photos, medical records, all of these other artifacts of their lives. And I think it's really fascinating and exciting to see the ways that poets are moving outside of the page. I mentioned Anthony Cody a minute ago, but his book can exist outside of the world because it has these QR codes that lead you onto the internet. It's very interesting. Are there any gaps that you still feel need to be addressed or filled? I know that's kind of a big question.
I think people are afraid of failing. I think people know the books that are getting a lot of attention, and so those become these templates. And the idea of writing like a messy, disorganized, like just a regular old collection of poems that are doing weird things that are new, or like I with this new book that I'm working on, there's a part of me that I'm so uncomfortable with it because it's so my kids used to say regular, and so they're very regular. And and I think like this isn't interesting, but I think there's a part of like me in my mind that's like, but you know what's regular is like not regular anymore. So maybe it's actually more transgressive to be regular than not. But like the idea of an archival project that's like, I want to investigate the history of this, mine disaster that happened from the hometown where my great-great-grandmother was from. And it's like, that's so interesting, but why? Like I think like that question of the why, I'm curious about people maybe, digging in a little bit more deeply about what their stake is in those particular stories or how they're penetrating them. And then, and just writing, the world is so dark, and I think there's something important about documenting history, but there's also something I think very human and important about writing about our ordinary life, and that can be as transgressive as anything else.
Oh, I love that so much. I feel like my newer poems feel so domestic, and I want to resist that urge, but I think I'll lean in now. What about you, Rico?
I was going to say that the notion of our multiple identities, our multiple selves, because we now live in a space where you do have you're multi-ethnic in the true sense of the word, or even you're moving from one faith to another. I'm still curious about those. I know there's a little bit out there exploring these themes, but I would like to see more. Only because I feel like that's still these are still subjects that that demand more complexity, so that we can understand a little better about what these movements are for people who move from, say, one faith to another, or this is why I think transliterature is so important. It's showing us the complexity of this, the complexities that are being sort of resisted in the political world, right? And so I like to see that in other spaces too, in terms of identities.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think it's important to note that, the work of literary citizens in arts administration, editors, sometimes we don't always get it right, or, we're all humans, and sometimes we try something and it's met with disappointment by the larger community, or some people might feel like left out. What advice do you have for up-and-coming arts administrators and editors in navigating those kinds of situations?
Tough choices. I mean, there's always tough choices to make, and the point is not to go at it by saying, I'm going to try to make as many people happy. It's not about that. It's not about it's not really about the people that you're bringing to the anthology. It's really about what does this project, what is it doing for our community? And if individuals don't understand that it's about the community and not about them, then they're making something that personal that is not meant to be personal. It's not a personal attack. It's not a personal slight, right? But I understand, we're human, we respond to it that way, and that's fine. That's fine. You know, I think Carmen and I, we've been around. We got thick skins, right? But at the same time, I'm speaking now as folks who may feel like they've been left out or they've been ignored, that don't take it personally, you know, because it's not about, it really isn't about you. It's about something bigger than you. And I think that's, at least for me, you know, when of course we know you feel left out, but then you think, okay, but the choices that were made, how is that a positive thing for the community? And I think if you focus on that, you understand, at least, I'm not sure if it takes away the pain, but at least helps you get out of yourself because it's not about you.
Yeah, that's great. Carmen?
Yeah, you know, I grew up, my parents always worked in restaurants, and so to me, like, the restaurant is this metaphor for life. And I think front of house, back of house. And I think what literary citizens is, we do back of house. And it's messy, and it's dirty, and people are yelling, and, you know, and there are all of these pieces of back of house that people who are sitting there waiting for their food don't understand, and get angry and get Karenish about. And so I think, like, when you see an organization or someone doing this work, you have to understand there's all these pieces that are out of our control, or that have to do with larger institutional forces, or that have to do that you have to run to buy cilantro at the store because they ran out, you know, that have nothing to do with what ends up happening in the front of house. And the work, the art, the books, all of that, that's front of house. But everything else, the real chemistry, I guess you could just watch that show, The Bear. That's actually what the work is like, is the craziness, the chaos. But it's orchestrated, and it, you know, it's so beautiful. And maybe at the end of the day, do some back of house work, and just to understand, or at least like ask questions about how, you know, when I started this job at Grey Wolf, man, it was quite a learning curve. There are just so many pieces of it that will, and they don't need to be legible to everybody. But before, you know, people start asking questions or saying, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? It's not just that it's not about you, it's that it's about this massive machine that has to work on so many different levels. It's not, you know, it's layers and layers of stakeholders and people that are involved in every aspect of something coming into the world, that it's never just the little piece that you see. This is a giant ecosystem. And so the more that you can learn about it, and just, I think, just show grace towards one another. I think, like, that's really so important to this work. Because The Bear, yeah, just watch The Bear.
Oh my gosh, I love that show. It's so stressful to watch, though. I don't know if y'all have seen it. I love you being like, just watch The Bear to understand. But have you guys, what is the most challenging thing for both of you as literary citizens, or like, what was the most challenging instance, if you can talk about it? I know there's often challenges, but
Trying to think.
I'm sure there's
No
been many,
challenges.
though.
It's been easy sailing the whole time. No, you know what? I mean, I'm trying to be honest with this answer, but just like going back to something I said earlier about time and energy, just like we take time away from our significant others, our friends, our families, to be able to sit down and write a poem, work on a story. You know, this work also requires that level of sacrifice, you know? And so, and I'll be honest, sometimes I would feel as if I'm giving way more, right, than I should, that I'm missing out on things. And I think we all do as writers. We feel like, oh, you know, I'm missing out on something because I'm doing this, but we know, but I've got like a higher cause here, a greater cause, and I'm doing this for a reason. And so I articulate that as a writer, but then I have to do it again as somebody who's doing this kind of other labor, right? So there were times, I would say, that I would sit there like, okay, you know, days have gone by, and I haven't really done anything for me. The self-care, the buzzword, right? The self-care is being neglected. And I think that for me has been the most challenging thing is to really own up to that, you know what, I think it's fine. If I scale back, somebody else will have to do the work, and that is not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's really hard to kind of balance the time and make sure, you take care of yourself. What about you, Carmen?
Yeah, I mean, I think one time I saw Rigo and I was like, he's like, you don't have to do everything. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And it was just so important for someone to say that, because you do feel like it. You see, and you're trying to do a lot of things at once, but you leave the space and someone's going to step into it. You just have to, you have to trust it. But I do think the challenge is that there's a sense of like who you are as an artist can be overshadowed by the work that you do. And so if you, someone said to me, when you step into this role, the way you're perceived as a poet will never be the same. It will come second to what you do as an editor. And that's based on history. That's just based on the way the world works. You can't, it's hard for people to see you at being good at two things, like, or whatever. And so I think like that's a real challenge. I know that you and I have also talked about.
Yeah, I want to add to that. One time on my Wikipedia page, somebody put that my work as an activist had outshadowed or something my work as a writer. I don't know who put that on there. Was it Eduardo? But I know, and I don't know how to do. I don't know how to do Wikipedia. I don't know who I finally got my students. Can you find a way to take that off, because that's rude.
Oh my God. But how do you reconcile that within yourselves? You're both such beautiful artists, and
No me importa.
The only reason I found out because I was being introduced at something, and somebody just resorted to printing the Wikipedia page.
No, they did it.
They did it, but they didn't read that part. But I saw it, and I go, wait a minute, I hope you're not going to read that,
Oh my gosh. Let me check the time. I think we're just about out of time, but I really appreciate you both. As a recovering people pleaser, I really appreciate your advice. It always feels like you have to do everything, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sergio.